Welcome to the Korea Pro podcast. I'm your host, Jeongmin Kim, the editorial director of Korea Pro.
And I'm John Lee, the editor of Korea Pro.
Join us for a weekly 15-minute conversation as we dive into the most pressing stories shaping South Korea and dissect the most complicated ones for you.
From politics to culture, technology to society, we've got you covered. So stay ahead of the curve and never be sidelined again.
So get ready for a fresh perspective on South Korea's news. This is the Korea Pro podcast. Welcome back to Korea Pro Podcast. I'm your host, Jeongmin Kim, and we are recording on November 25th, Monday, a little bit after 3 p.m. And today is a special episode. We have a guest in the podcast studio. Thank you for joining us today, Andrew. He's a senior fellow at a Foreign Policy Center for Asia Policy Studies and SK Korea Foundation Chair in Korean Studies at Brookings. Welcome back.
Thanks. It's wonderful to be here in person in the studio.
I think you have joined NK News podcast in the past, right?
I actually have not.
Really?
When I reached out to you, I was like, I could do the NK Pro podcast or Korea Pro, and somehow I got channeled into Korea Pro. So
I see. Well, welcome to joining the Korea Pro podcast for the first time. Then I guess everybody will already know what we will be talking about today. Trump 2.0. I guess you have already talked about this for weeks. Talking to Korea
experts. It's the talk of the town back in Washington, D.C.
Right, and that's what we want to kick off with. What's the mood in D.C. right after the election result, especially among Korea experts, like think tanks, academia?
Well, first, in terms of the mood generally, I mean, most people didn't think the election would be called the next day after elections. I thought that it might be another 2 or 3 days.
Right, that's why we were our event preparations as well. It was for like Friday.
Yeah, and then when I saw by about 11 p.m. on election night on that Tuesday that things were looking down for Harris, up for Trump. And then by midnight, I thought it was pretty clear the writing was on the wall. But of course, they didn't call the election until 5 a.m. But that meant people were sort of scrambling because I think others also thought that it would be a much closer race. I mean, Trump got 51%, almost 52% of the popular vote, which itself is a big deal because Republicans haven't won the popular vote in decades. But I think that was a bit of a surprise for those in D.C. We didn't expect there to be such a convincing win, I think, on the side of Trump. But that also meant that there were a lot of questions about how did this happen? Why did this happen? I live in D.C. I live in a neighborhood that's among a lot of progressives. And I suddenly was asking myself, am I reading too much New York Times, Washington Post? Should I have followed Fox News more? Because for me, it was a bit of a surprise. I mean, I knew the election would be close, but I didn't quite expect that. In terms of what it meant for folks in think tanks in the Korea space, there was lots of questions about what does a Trump 2.0 mean for the alliance, because the concerns have always been about tariffs, about the alliance burden share. There was much that was made about the comment about South Korea being a money machine just a few weeks before election night. And then, of course, the question about a Trump-Kim summit. So those were definitely on the minds of a lot of Korea watchers in D.C. And then we had a huge wave of Korean visitors from think tanks, different delegations last week. So there's multiple conferences and private meetings.
So people visited immediately to figure out the game plan.
There's some that came the following week, but there were several major events. CSIS had their strategic forum. Korea Society had a big event. We had an event at Brookings on Friday, although it was framed more in terms of the region, the Indo-Pacific region under the next administration and what the regional order would look like. But many private meetings at several think tanks about what Trump 2.0 means for the U.S.-Korea alliance and for Korea policy generally.
I won't ask you to name drop or anything from the private meetings, but from your impression, how do you feel like people visiting D.C. from Seoul, like feeling? What's the mood there?
There does seem to be some. So there are two minds. I think there is a little bit of anxiety just because of the uncertainty of a next administration. This would be true for any government when you're going from a Democrat to a Republican or a Republican to Democrat administration. But this is not any Republican candidate, now president-elect. This is Trump. And so I think because of that, the uncertainty or anxiety is heightened a bit more. But at the same time, there are others that know that the alliance is resilient, that the U.S. South Korea alliance survived the first Trump administration. More than survived, they actually coordinated on the inter-Korea summits, for instance, whether you agreed or disagreed. I mean, there was alignment with the Moon government at that point. Things got much more heated or contested afterwards when the Moon government was pushing for end of war declaration.
Wow, that feels like ages ago.
Yeah, I know. It feels like a very long time ago now. But there were others that said, so the Korean side was saying that Korean experts were saying, well, we've had experience with Trump before. We know that the alliance is resilient. And I do think that Koreans are much more prepared this time than they were in, of course, 2016, 2017, when there was a bit of a leadership vacuum. Park Geun-hye at the time was impeached.
Right. It was a horrible timing for South Korea as well, right?
They weren't able to put on with their game face like Shinzo Abe did, the Japanese prime minister at the time, whereas I kid you not, for the last year, every time there was delegations from South Korea coming to DC, they would ask the question about Trump to the point where it was almost annoying. I was like, look, guys, he hasn't been elected yet, but you're already getting worked up about Trump. So they have thought about this for a year. And
I see.
The Korean government, I think, also had, you probably saw circulating on social media some talking points about how Korea has contributed to the alliance, about the investments that they've made. The United States, $114 billion during the Biden administration. So I do think that they're better prepared this time around than Trump 1.0. And part of this was reflected even in the first phone call between President Yoon and President Trump.
The 12-minute one, right?
Yes, correct. And
the one where Yoon was like, oh, congratulations for winning under this grand slogan of MAGA.
Yes.
That was so well prepared, I think.
Well, but the part
it was
about...
very staged.
it was staged, but that it didn't go... I mean, I think the Korean media, of course, wanted to, or the Korean government perhaps, were feeding the media, they wanted to signal that the conversation was a good start. It was a good first step. And at least it didn't go off the rails. And probably in the talking points for Trump, maybe there was a memo that said, don't mention tariffs. And, probably someone had put in there, maybe one area for cooperation is on shipbuilding.
Yeah, shipbuilding. And they mentioned trilateral as well.
Yeah, the trilateral came up as well. That was President Yoon that brought it up, not President-elect Trump. So again, just going back to how Koreans are thinking about this, they want to try to make it as business as usual, but I think they have to have. I mean, I think it'll be trickier. The road will be bumpier than it was under the Biden administration, who was very clear and consistent that he wanted to strengthen networks of allies and partnerships, even if there were hiccups like the Inflation Reduction Act. But at least there was some more consistency under the Biden administration on its approach to alliances.
And I think with the Trump 2.0, the big variable also is not just Trump himself, but also people who he will be hiring and already sort of nominated. Are there any anxieties regarding that, and like from South Korean point of view, or people who might be involved in policy role in DC?
So for the South Koreans, they're trying to look at appointments like commerce, treasury, state, defense, of course, the national security advisor. And at least on the defense security side, there are some known people. So Senator Marco Rubio is appointed as, he's nominated. He'll be nominated for Secretary of State.
And Alex Wong.
Yeah, well, Alex Wong will be the Deputy National Security Advisor. Representative Mike Waltz, former Representative Mike Waltz, as National Security Advisor. And these folks suggest that, at least on Indo-Pacific policies, Trump will have a fairly robust, a peace through strength type approach to maybe the region, because these are China hawks.
China hawks and quite established as well.
Yeah, and in order for the U.S. to meet the challenges of China and to treat China as the long-term pacing challenge, they're going to need U.S. force presence in the region. They're going to need to work with allies. They're going to need to secure supply chains, which you can't do without working with Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, even though all these, Taiwan and South Korea have been criticized by Trump. But in terms of policy, in terms of ensuring that you maintain stability, security within the region, you're going to have to work with allies.
Right.
That's not to say that Trump isn't going to demand a greater alliance burden share from the South Koreans or even the Japanese, or he's going to slap tariffs or at least threaten to slap tariffs. I think that will still happen too. But at least based on the early picks on security, foreign policy, it looks like we're going to see more of the peace through strength approach to the region and not this idea that we're going back into isolationism or retrenchment or restraint.
So gathering the bits and pieces that I've heard so far, I'm guessing that you're saying people should not be as anxious as some people are, considering the picks?
So that's my view. And I did a op-ed with Korea Herald that I wanted to direct to a Korean audience. So they headlined it as, an optimistic view of the lines. I mean, I would say maybe cautiously optimistic, but there are reasons why I think the U.S. under a Trump 2.0 in South Korea would still need to cooperate. And even if Trump thinks about America first, especially on the Indo-Pacific questions, I think that's the biggest reason why I think the alliance and USFK, U.S. force presence on the peninsula is still important to Trump. If he doesn't see it, at least the people that he's appointed fully understand that. And there are other people too, like on the U.S., Japan, Korea trilateral. There have been folks that have his ear that are close around him among Republican circles that have said that they feel that this trilateral is really a step forward. They may want to orient it more towards China or the Indo-Pacific and not just focus so much on North Korea. But the point is they haven't said that they think this is a waste of time. We want to do away with these trilaterals, these minilaterals. They haven't said that. So I take that as a good sign so far.
So about that, what you mentioned about the troops, actually, one follow-up question, like a few people in DC that I've recently talked to, they were actively concerned about the troop, not withdrawal, but recalibration of their purposes or the downscaling of the troops. Do you think this is a real possibility that South Korea should be putting some attention to?
Maybe more on the repurposing of USFK. I do think that there may be some pressure with the next administration with Trump to think about using USFK in wider contingencies. This gets back to the idea of strategic flexibility, that U.S. forces Korea is not just for deterring against a North Korea attack, not just for defense on the Korean Peninsula, but that it could be used, let's say, in a Taiwan Strait contingency or some other out-of-area conflict, most likely, again, with China, because that's the direction that I think Republicans want. I mean, they see China as the really big problem. North Korea is probably down the list of priorities. And even when I talk to some folks, or when I have talked to folks in USFK, they've also said too, we think the Koreans can hold their own on the conventional side against North Korea, that they're more than fully prepared. It's really the nuclear deterrence that they aren't able to really to put up front against the North Koreans. So they need the extended deterrence, but in terms of conventional deterrence, South Korean forces are sufficient. So why do you need USFK? So from the U.S. point of view, the USFK those are the only forces that are actually on the continent of Asia. And if there was any kind of conflict, you could use the forces, the facilities for a variety of purposes. And so that's why USFK may still be seen as important to a Trump administration.
Right. And that might be a way for South Korea to sort of negotiate with Trump.
Yeah, so that's where I think we're going to have to see some maybe bargaining where South Korea provides some more flexibility on how they see USFK or even their own role on things like a Taiwan Strait contingency. And that might protect the threat of Trump saying, well, if they're not going to be used for purposes beyond the Korean Peninsula,
add value to our Indo-Pacific
so then why do we
security.
need 28,500 troops? Why don't we just then
And Trump's like, I trust
numbers?
Kim Jong-un.
Yeah.
Right? Here's the thing. I know people hate hypothetical questions, but just reasonably looking at the approval rate so far of the People Power Party, the Democratic Party, and current Yoon's approval rate, it looks very unlikely that it will be easy for the PPP to retain the government in 2027. And let's say, fast forward to 2027, there is some discussion about repurposing USFK, and there's a progressive government in South Korea. And Lee Jae-myung, the current party leader, although he has some, his own legal challenges that he is facing right now, so the future is uncertain for the DP. But let's say there is a possibility there's a progressive government in South Korea as Trump's counterpart. In that case, wouldn't this all become a problem if South Korea then considers, repurposing to counter China, we hate it because we want to get along with China?
In that case, and they would have a very short window. The overlap would be what, like 27 into 28? Because then 28 would be his last year in office. So they would have
And he
have
doesn't
some
have the
overlap.
next term.
Yeah. But in that case, it would be more likely that the DP says, well, if you want to reduce forces, that's where I think the Trump administration, maybe the Democratic Party, whoever is president then may align on that front where
Reducing.
Yeah, where they see the reductions.
For different reasons, though.
Yeah,
right?
Definitely for different reasons. For South Korea, for the DP, it would be more about autonomy. It would be
the usual NL, national.
Yeah, and they, in terms of being able to engage North Korea, that might be a talking point. And then for the U.S., of course, it's because they don't want to spend the money, or they don't think they think that Korea should do more on its own. And that's where I think they could meet each other halfway.
I think Lee Jae-myung is already thinking about that scenario, because just this morning, right before the verdict, where he was ruled not guilty for the first trial, he wrote like a message to Trump saying, "Oh, if you want to run for Nobel Peace Prize, I will recommend you for the nomination if you win the Ukraine war. I know you have worked so hard for North Korea summit." I can see where he's going with this, right?
Korea Pro, your gateway to expert South Korea intelligence. Korea Pro helps you stay on top of the most important issue of the day with a daily executive briefing every morning and a curated overview of Korean and international headlines. Get access to our analysts' comprehensive insights on South Korea's economy, politics, security, and society. Keep track of upcoming events and developments with our Monday Week Ahead newsletter. If you need an overview of the week that was, stay updated with our weekly podcast. Korea Pro transforms complex information into actionable business intelligence for companies, policymakers, and researchers covering the South Korea portfolio. Visit koreapro.org/podcast and never be sidelined again.
Moving on to not domestic relations problems, but trade that you just mentioned briefly earlier about tariffs. There have been a lot of concerns here, and the stock price went up and down because of the Trump election result. Is this a serious concern compared to the Biden administration period for the businesses here?
Trump has stated that he would put a 10%, some numbers say between 10 and 20% tariffs across the board for all trade partners. And it would be problematic for South Korea for sure, because it means, one, South Korean products would be expensive, and and there may be retaliation on South Korea's side as well, too, against the U.S. So there's a problem there from that point of view. And then also in terms of South Korean businesses, it's already not clear what the $114 billion that were invested under the Biden administration would look like. If you put in those tariffs, what happens to those investments that were made? Because it takes time for the gains, the profits to be realized. But if you are putting tariffs in place, what does that do with, how does that affect, exports and imports? I think, it would also make it difficult for companies to think about investing further in the United States. And so basically the trend that we'd seen under the Biden administration would come to a close. That would certainly restrict. I do think the economic piece for Biden was a really big deal on the U.S. South Korea relations. And so with Trump adding these tariffs, I think that level of engagement, the robustness of the lines on the economic front would reverse itself. And so that would be huge for South Korea, which depends heavily on trade. I also think there could be other implications beyond trade in terms of just foreign policy relations. Would China try to come in and woo Korean companies or businesses to invest in China? So it could be a different landscape, but
and say IPEF sucked and RCEP is much better.
Yeah, so it can go in multiple different directions, but certainly for South Korea, the tariffs will be a problem.
I mean, South Korea is trying to diversify the supply chain a little bit more, but that's going to take time. So they're still very export dependent when it comes to U.S. South Korea. But then it seems South Korean government is preparing for scenarios related to tariff risks. And this week, I just wrote a week ahead. Industries Ministry and the SMEs Ministry, they are doing a new task force team meetings starting this week to prepare for Trump 2.0. if you were advising them, what would be like priority risks or scenarios you would ask industries or SMEs ministries to consider when they're handling Trump scenarios?
Well, a lot of the investments have been in semiconductors and EV batteries. That's where a lot of the big investments have been made. And I think they have to consider where Trump is going in terms of clean energy policy. So, for instance, if you in the U.S., if EV sales have already flatlined, but if there are no incentives to buy electric vehicles, what's it mean for all the investments they've made with batteries? Like LG, SK, they have deals with GM or Ford, but they're not going to really be making any money. So I think for the SME, for the different ministries in Korea, they would have to reassess what is it that we can actually invest in the U.S. So in terms of other areas on clean energy policy, there are investments in things like wind or solar.
Right.
What's going to happen with that sector. But then there are other places where there is room for growth. So Trump is talking about fossil fuels going back into the mix. So is there
which you seemed also interested, honestly,
yeah, because Koreans still rely on LNG, and that's something that they could import from the United States, which might make Trump happy. So I would say,
small victories for Trump.
So you would want to assess and look at the different industries where you think there's room for cooperation. You would want to see, who Trump is picking for certain appointments. What areas does he find important in terms of trade? So with tariffs, certainly if you start buying more U.S. products, is there things that South Koreans can import from the United States that could help reduce the trade imbalance? If I looked at actually the trade data, and in terms of the deficit, it had grown quite a bit, in part because of all the Korean investments in the U.S. I think it was around 18 billion and okay, don't quote me on this, 18 or 20 billion, around that ballpark in 2018, and then in 2023 it was about 51 billion. So it's going in the wrong direction. But if Trump really cares a lot about the trade deficit or trade imbalances, I would also try to find ways where you could correct that, but in a way that would be beneficial for South Korea's economy as well.
Well, it's the difficult thing with Trump is that Trump is not driven by just numbers, or like he has very specific personal motivation when he's conducting statecraft or thinking of diplomatic directions. If we're speaking to, if any trade negotiators or any other diplomatic counterparts in South Korea are listening, how would you explain Trump's main motivation in running for the presidency? Again, what is it that Trump wants to achieve in his second term?
Right. Well, the first time when he ran, people were trying to understand his motive. Is it just about his personality, about entertainment? Is it really does he really have an agenda or a vision? And I think in the first term, that it was a lot more ambiguous. But the second term, because people had talked about the MAGA wing, so make America great again, or America first. But was it about, returning to conservative traditional values? I mean, these are all different facets, I think, of what Trump tried to promote during his campaign. But I do think at the end of the day, he keeps saying "Make America Great Again," which doesn't imply that America isn't great, does it? But it's kind of, people will define or interpret in the way that they want. But I do think Trump has some things that he wants to accomplish. He mentioned, government efficiency. This is DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, that Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy are supposed to head. So I think there was a New York Times piece I was reading where they say it's not driven by efficiency, it's driven more by retribution. But he does want to trim waste. I do think that he has certain views about the United States and what sort of people it should be comprised of, or its makeup or composition. He doesn't like illegal immigrants. He said that he's going to deport them all. So I think he wants to strengthen border security. That's a huge issue for him. And also, he thinks that countries are taking advantage of the United States. And that's sapped our strength, our economy.
Which is apparently getting traction from the voters.
Yeah, so that's why you talk about tariffs, or making NATO or Japan or Korea pay more for the defense. He's not driven by economic logic. In some ways, adding more tariffs when he did the trade war with China, this didn't make Americans better off. In fact, the numbers suggest that it was worse off in farmers in the Midwest because of the retaliation from China. They weren't able to sell their pork or their beans.
If that was South Korea, there would have been Gwanghwamun protest immediately.
Yeah, but within his framework or frame of mind, I think he believes that countries have taken advantage of the U.S. It's weakened the United States, and he wants to restore American strength. So
he does not want America to be a pushover, basically.
Yeah, exactly. And he always talks about how good he is in making deals, how he's in negotiating. So I think he thrives in really trying to set up a hard bargain with other countries. I think he really thrives in that. In making these demands, driving a hard bargain, and I mean that's not really the way you think about running a country, but that is his frame of mind.
Which leads to my last question, which is like a broad general question. He does seem like a leader with a certain very specific, particular political philosophy that he sort of continues in his first term and now probably in the second term as well. Like what kind of America is a great one, for instance. But like you mentioned, popular vote, it shows that there is an audience for that in America and it increased the number. What does this say about just America in general, not the leadership or politicians or elites or Senate or whatnot? What does this say about the voters? And should South Korea be concerned or be prepared for future, way far ahead administrations if this sort of leader continues to pop up anymore?
Yeah, so the surprise for those who are in the Democrat orbit or Harris supporters, it was a bit shocking because here's someone who is a convicted felon who has lots of scandals. First term, okay, maybe we weren't as aware about Trump or his backstories, but we've seen him in action, and despite his rhetoric, his language, more people voted for him, not less. So from that point of view, you might be troubled. I was asked this question about what happens after Trump. Will the MAGA movement continue to exist? Will people like J.D. Vance or Marco Rubio, who's tapped to be Secretary of State, will they carry the mantra? And my thought is, MAGA it may die down. We more than a decade ago, there was the Tea Party among Republicans that was quite vibrant, but that then enveloped into some other movement. And so they had their gains, but it died down. I feel like MAGA will move in the same direction, but some of these messages like the economic nationalism or this idea, I think those will be attractive to just ordinary Americans, the ordinary workers, those who are concerned about day-to-day paychecks, about the price of goods. I think that's something that political leaders will have to keep in tune. I think certainly the message about immigration, and that's going to continue to resonate among Americans. I grew up in Ohio in a county that I think that I don't remember ever going Democrat. So I sort of understand what this vision looks like. You hear that there's a lot of social spending for different groups, for immigrants, and then there are other people who don't really rely on government. They kind of do things on their own. That's their way of life. I think for those folks, there will be something that resonates with what Trump has called for, with the economic nationalism, with these populist appeals, and something like trade, free trade. That's not even mentioned by either party. So I think that's the direction that perhaps the U.S. may go in, and that's where we see some contradictions. One where we see more economic nationalism rising within the general population. But for Trump, he also has this peace through strength, military hegemony, this argument about, American power abroad. And those things sometimes contradict. I think that's the biggest part about trying to figure out who or where Trump is heading. But in the future, I think some of these trends will continue. And I don't know what that means for, I think, the Democrat Party when we get to the next election.
Well, academics for the past, I think, 3 or 4 decades kept asking this question: is the American hegemony dead? Unipolar world, did we ever actually have that? Where has it ended, if there was something like that? And now people are saying, is it really, really dead now that Trump is in? And we are seeing this potential trajectory of not so much multilateral, like security or trade-wise, not so much of a multilateral leader America anymore. Would you say that it's dead or it was already dead?
It's been in decline. So U.S. influence has been declining just as other countries are becoming more important, like China, perhaps India. But I wouldn't say it's dead. Someone had framed it as, before U.S. was seen as the indispensable nation in this liberal international order that the U.S. had set up since 1945. But what you would want the U.S. to move into is to become an indispensable partner. So you still need the U.S. engaged to get results done. So I don't think we can write off the United States, but I do think that we are seeing over time a decrease in U.S. influence in a different issue areas. Some say that Trump means that this is sort of the end of the U.S. primacy area, what we've known. I mean, it's hard to say because he's probably going to increase the defense budget, is my sense. And he talks about competition with China. It's whether you can have your cake and eat it too. You talk about being powerful, making America great, but then retrenching. Those are two different trends. But it's not Trump alone. There's other agents, there's other actors that shape American foreign policy. So I think America will still be on the world stage for quite some time.
Well, something for South Korean government to consider going forward. Thank you very much for joining us today, Andrew. It's been around 30 minutes or so. We haven't really discussed Ukraine or any other topics that has been on my mind, but I guess I can also zoom you in.
Sure. We can save that for the next conversation.
Yeah, let's do that. Thank you for listening.
Thanks.
Introducing Korea Pro, your all-in-one South Korea intelligence solution. Start each day with our executive briefing on the most crucial issue and a snapshot of key Korean and international headlines. Gain deeper understanding through our original analysis on South Korea's economy, politics, security and society. Our Monday Week Ahead newsletter prepares you for upcoming business and political events, while the weekly podcast keeps you informed on recent developments. Get clear, actionable business intelligence every day. Visit koreapro.org/podcast and never be sidelined again.
And that's a wrap. Thanks for tuning in.
If you want to know more, sign up for our daily executive briefings. We brief you on all you need to know from the past 24 hours and why they matter every morning in your inboxes.
Don't forget to subscribe to our podcast for your weekly dose of insight. And until next time, I'm Jeongmin Kim.
And I'm John Lay. Stay connected, stay informed, and we'll see you next time on the Korea Pro Podcast.